Hello, everybody. I'm Pam from the Learning Guild. Welcome to Coal or Presence, the metrics C-suite uses to decide on L&D resources. We're going to give you a few minutes to get into the room, to let people get into the room, and then Aurelien will start his presentation, talking about how to use data to speak to the C-suite at your organization. Hello, everybody. I'm Pam from the Learning Guild, and I'm going to hand this over to Aurelien, who's going to talk to you about using data to speak to the C-suite about L&D resources. Take it away, Aurelien.
All right, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. So I think Pam is in a very snowy Montana. I'm actually calling from a very unsnowy Aix-en-Provence. I'm in the south of France. So this is going to be a little bit of an international session, and looking forward to learning a little bit all together about how we can better communicate the value of what we do to the C-suite. The C-suite being the senior executives and the leadership who often, let's be frank, are a little bit skeptical and a little bit misunderstanding of the value that L&D truly brings to the org. So welcome, everyone. And yes, I think, thank you. I think the camera issue just got fixed. So I want to start off with a question, actually, before I introduce myself. Would love to hear from the participants here. What are the primary metrics that you currently report to decision makers? So decision makers here being the people in your organization that ultimately make the decisions about which resources to allocate to your team and to other teams. Please post in the chat. Just thinking about the last time you had to report something back up to leadership, what were the metrics that you used? I promise not to put anyone on the spot. You can just post in the chat thinking about what are the metrics that you report, if any. And actually, if you're like, I don't actually report any metrics, that's okay too. All right, number of attendees signed up versus actually completed. Very good one, very common one. Any others? Anyone else want to post any other metric that you have used to report to decision makers? Interviews, yeah. If you do interviews, focus groups, feedback from users, or from attendees, participants, learners, that's all good stuff. Engagement in terms of the attendance is great. Completion, that's also something that you can share. Anything else? And has anyone else shared any other data back to their decision makers to convince them and to update them on how the work you're doing is going? All right. So it's okay if we're not right now in the mindset of sharing a lot of data or a lot of metrics, this is exactly what this session is about. If you're a little bit not sure how to answer this question, or you're not sure that you have the right answer to this question, then you are in the right session, because this is actually everything that I'm going to be talking to you about. So I'm going to start with another trivia question. So what do decision makers care about? So I'm from the world of management consulting. I have worked a lot with decision makers. We're talking, everyone, business decision makers, government decision makers, people ranging from, like VPs, line managers, etc., all the way up to, the C-suite, the CEOs, the CFOs, the COOs, those kinds of people. So want to quickly ask if anyone can guess who this person is that I'm sharing on the screen. This is a very old person. I think they lived about 2,000 years ago, and they are kind of the original C-suite person, if you can imagine, one of the very first businessmen in the history of the world. Anyone want to take a guess as to who this person might be? It's okay, you can take a random guess. Socrates, okay, yes, we're in the right part of the world. Augustus Caesar, getting closer. Plato. So I think we've had some guesses for philosophers. We've had Augustus Caesar. I think out of the guesses so far, Casey's a bit closer, but it is the Greco-Roman world. And the answer is this is, men may not have heard of. Ooh, Caligula, very close. So this is Marcus Licinius Crassus. So Marcus Licinius Crassus was a person from the same time period as Julius Caesar. He was actually one of Julius Caesar's main allies in Rome and became part of, the ruling power of Rome. But Marcus Licinius Crassus is also famous because he basically set up the world's first business empire. He became the world's richest man in Rome. That's why he's famous. And a lot of historians now think he may have been the richest man in history if you kind of adjust for inflation. He basically owned like half of the real estate of Rome. He owned massive agriculture. He's the person, if you've ever seen a show about like Spartacus or someone, Licinius Crassus is actually the person who kills Spartacus. So anyway, very bloody, very Roman, very, lots of suspense and intrigue. But Marcus Licinius Crassus is also quite interesting because he is a decision maker who represents kind of like a person who, even though they lived 2,000 years ago, there's probably certain things that we could talk to them about that we can also talk to a current day executive that they would totally understand. And at the same time, there's a lot of things that have changed in the world that they wouldn't understand. So obviously, Crassus is not going to understand something about the internet or modern tools. He's not going to understand a lot of the data talk that we're talking about. He's not going to understand all of the jargon that has changed. But there is something that Crassus and every business executive today understands in the same exact way, which is that when you start to talk to them about revenue and cost, when you start to talk to them about profits, when you tell them, I want to explain how I'm maximizing the performance of your workforce, or if you're explaining to them, this is how we're minimizing compliance or regulatory risk, even though he lived 2,000 years ago, Crassus would understand that. And that's, I think, the core language of business decision makers that we also need to appreciate, that at the C-suite, this is how they think, and this is how they have been thinking for 2,000 years, right? In terms of the bottom line, in terms of business revenue minus business cost equals profit, and their core job is to maximize profit. And the way they do that is through things like maximizing the performance of the workforce or minimizing the different risks that they're facing. And as long as we speak the language of L&D and we're not really converting it into the language of business decision makers, there's a bit of a disconnect. And at the same time, there's a power dynamic, right? Because if we don't understand the business language, or we don't use the business language, and they don't understand and they don't use the language of L&D, well, one of us should learn to speak the language of the other. because of the power dynamic, it's probably us that has to learn the language of the decision makers. It's probably not the decision makers that are going to learn the language of L&D. So that is where I'm going to segue. And if it's okay, I'm actually just going to re-share my screen. Here we go.
Able to share? Do you not have sharing?
Sorry, yes, I was just switching to presenter view. I've okay, here we go. Is everything sharing? Perfect.
Yes, looks good.
Okay, cool. So my name's Aurelien. I currently teach business intelligence and data analytics for teams in business and government, ranging from data science teams all the way to people who have never really used data before. And as I mentioned, in my past life, I was a management consultant. So I spent a lot of my time advising the C-suite about what to do, including things that relate to L&D and training, but also a lot of things that are more generally related to business strategy. So I'm quite familiar with the types of questions that C-suite bring to people like management consultants, and all of my experiences working with decision makers. I've also worked a lot with decision makers in government and NGOs, so we can also ask any questions about that. But the purpose of this session is going to focus a lot more on business decision makers rather than government. But there's a lot of similarities. And I also have found experience on the other side. I manage a team of 40 full-time employees and also have hundreds of irregular employees that I work with. So I also get to see a little bit of the other side of things, being a little bit of a decision maker as well. And in particular, the main thing that I want to share with you is what I've learned from the world of management consulting, because I think management consulting is actually a very good example of an industry that it doesn't do anything that is, particularly easier to quantify or, when I compare management consulting and L&D, I think L&D and management consulting both struggle with similar challenges, which is that we're working on things, whether it's business strategy or learning and development, which are very cross-cutting. They're empowering huge sections of the organization, but they don't map out that cleanly to, sales is easy. It just drives more sales. Marketing is easy. I can just calculate the number of customers acquired. L&D and management consulting are similar in that the work that we're providing is a lot harder to relate to the bottom line. And as a result, it's a lot harder to, to really build buy-in and really get stakeholder support. But at the same time, the difference, I think, is that management consulting has done a really good job of learning to speak the language of decision makers, so that even when management consultants are often not doing things that are more valuable than L&D, they're better at communicating it. And being able to speak the language of decision makers, I think, is the reason that, say, consulting has become such a huge and big industry, because they're really able to cleanly interact with decision makers, and decision makers feel like they're interacting on the same wavelength. They're speaking the same language. And I want to give you some examples of speaking to decision makers using the language they know. And as I go through, I've got 3 examples. As I go through each of these examples, feel free to ask any questions in the chat if you have any, or just unmute and ask. So first situation, I want to walk through a situation which might be a situation that you might encounter, a pretty routine situation. And it's a situation where you can actually see how by communicating about it in a slightly different way, we can actually build a lot of buy-in from our stakeholders, especially in the C-suite. So here, let's say that our situation is we have received a request from the sales team, and the sales team requested us to conduct a productivity training so that sales agents can be more effective. Now, this might be something that happens pretty often at our organization. We might have materials in our content library. Maybe we organize something with our trainers or with the subject matter experts. I'm not going to focus on that. That's the core work of L&D, right? But what matters is that this is an opportunity for us to showcase the business impact of L&D. And in general, any kind of sales training is an amazing opportunity because sales trainings are one of the things that are connected to those core business performance indicators that people like Marcus Licinius Crassus really care about. And what they really care about is revenue. Revenue is what they're excited about. And when we talk about sales, we're actually talking about revenue. So here's an example, and here's the first method that I would use if I really wanted to get the C-suite on my side and convince them that I'm providing an essential service for the organization, and I really want to build buy-in, which is that I'm going to connect myself to increasing the revenue of the company. I want to show evidence that I am actually contributing to increasing the revenue of this company, and that is, something that a C-suite exec wants to hear, wants to have people on the team that are providing this. And for that, I need to answer 2 core questions, which I have here, that can really address the goals and expectations of my stakeholders. So here's an example of how I might use the language of decision makers to report back to them on how I did a training. So in this case, I might run a sales training, right? I run the productivity training. And what I'm going to show is called a pre and post analysis. It's a pretty simple pre and post analysis. What I do is I run the training. It's organizing your time as a salesperson, improving your productivity. And before I do that, I want to ask the sales team, lead, what are the metrics that are most important to you? What are the metrics that you want to improve with this training? And these metrics should be related to your business indicators, right? And this is a little bit hard. They might not want to give you the data. They might not be used to asking for this. You might not have currently be working like this, but this is actually what you need, because if you can get the metrics of the sales team, you're getting the metrics that matter for their targets. And the sales team targets are always targets that really, really deeply impact the business performance. So in this case, one example might be the sales team. The lead tells me that the number of calls scheduled is the metric that she cares about, and that's the metric that she wants to improve with a productivity training. So now what I would do is I would ask the sales team to give me a little bit of data, tell me about the number of sales calls that your agents are making per week. Give me the data before the training, and then after the training, I'm going to request you to share with me 2 to 3 months worth of data. And then that's all I'm going to do is I'm just going to graph what's the average calls per week for the sales agents. And I'm going to just identify on the graph, this is when our training happened. And now I can show a little pre and post analysis. And in this case, if I've got something like this is fantastic, because now what I'm showing is that actually after I did the training, the sales calls went up. And when I'm the sales team lead, this makes me really happy, because this is the metric that really matters to the sales team. And when the sales team shows this to their supervisors, or if we share this to the C-suite, they are going to be very happy as well, because these are the things that relate to revenue. Yes. So that's the first question. How are you improving the revenue? So in this case, I might not have the core number of the revenue, but I have a sales KPI. And because sales is connected to the KPI or is connected to revenue, that is something I can already share. Now, the other thing is I could go even further. I could try and actually calculate how much is the revenue going to increase based on, what I see is, based on after our sales training, the calls per week improved by about 20%. I can, very quickly just do the math on that. And then if I have a little bit of background with business math, or if I could have someone on the sales team, like a sales analyst, help me do some of the calculation, they could actually calculate, if your sales call per week go up by 21%, then based on the conversion metrics, this is the expected impact on revenue. Those are actually not very difficult things to calculate for someone with a sales background, sales analysis background. So you could maybe ask a counterpart to help you with that. If you can share that, then even better, because now you're showing the actual dollar revenue, but that's not always needed. And I would say 90% of the time, what I'm showing here is enough. you can already just show, hey, these are the sales team KPIs. I'm contributing to the sales team KPIs by showing this pre and post. All right. So I think I'll pause if there's any questions about this. And this is really, I think, the kind of key thing to take away. If you want to show the C-suite that you are in, that L&D is playing a vital role in the future of the company, you need to move to the metrics that matter the most to the C-suite. And the C-suite metrics that matter are going to be metrics that affect revenue or that affect costs. And you are going to need to get data from other teams. Like this data, you can only get the sales team to give you that data.
Don't have any questions in the chat yet, so you can keep going.
Cool. All right. So also there might be some maybe questions that people haven't asked. Now, if you are looking at this and you're thinking, oh, I don't really do pre and post analyses. I think this is, already something kind of new for me. Then I recommend this is the best place to start. Like start doing pre and post analyses on the business metrics for, the important trainings that you do. This is already, I would say, most of the time, if you just share this to people, this is enough to convince them. This is enough for them to have enough evidence that actually, okay, your training is really valuable. It is really bringing something important to the business team. Now, some of you may already be doing pre and post analyses. And if so, you may be thinking, oh, are there more advanced forms of analysis? What if the rise in calls per week that you're showing on the graph, what if it's not actually caused by the training? What if it's caused by something else? And that's called a confounding variable. I'll show you in a later example how you can do something slightly more advanced when you actually want to control for that. So there are more advanced forms of analysis than pre and post, but pre and post is a very core one. And then the other one is a side question. What if you do the pre and post analysis, but the numbers aren't very good? So actually you do it and it's not showing any improvement. It's a flat line, right? We're not actually improving the business metrics from the training. So if you have something like that and you find that the numbers don't actually go up, this is where I think you need to really evaluate how can you use this to improve your training? How can you iterate on your training to improve on this? And I think Megan has actually published many things about this because this is really the context of learning from Agile. Things like lots like Agile methods is really valuable for this because what you can do is basically every time you run your training, you do a little bit of pre and post analysis. If you find in your pre and post analysis that actually your training is really contributing to improving the KPI, then that's great. You can, move on to the next thing. If you find that your training is not contributing to the KPI, then from the C-suite's perspective, your training is not really having the effect that it's intended. And that's the time when you want to iterate on your training. And the best thing that I would recommend if you're going to present that data to the C-suite is that you could share the data that says, look, this is the training. It didn't actually affect the KPI that we wanted to. So we really deep dived into the training. We did interviews with people. We've debriefed with our subject matter experts. And based off of this, we have a general idea of maybe these are the reasons why it wasn't as effective. And these are the things that we're going to change in the next iteration so that the training does improve our KPIs. And I think as long as you have a clear idea of aligning your training to improving business performance, this is how you're going to build stakeholder buy-in. Oh, yes, Christian, it might not be a training related issue. Yes, absolutely. So this is where I think in a minute, I'll just share a little bit about doing something different, which is the how do you adjust for some of these confounding variables like non-training related issue. But pre and post analyses are usually kind of like a good starting point. And oftentimes because they're one of the easiest and simplest analyses to carry out. And
There's a
Megan,
question about using aggregated or anonymous versus individually identified data. Do you have any preference or guidance around using that
Oh,
one over the other?
yes, yes. So I would recommend when you're starting out, aggregated data is going to be a lot easier to analyze, and it's going to be a lot less burden for you in terms of the data analysis. Like this kind of pre and post analysis that I'm showing here, this is probably literally just like the average of all of the aggregated data. And sometimes it's also easier for the business team if they have to provide some data, they might find it easier to provide you the aggregate because you don't have as many like privacy concerns. If you are going to use individual data, whether you anonymize it or you leave individual identifiers, I think you'll have, I think you need a very clear like reason for that. And I think these are going to be the much more advanced use cases, which I'm not going to jump into. Like if you want to identify like individual improvements for different learners. So I would say to begin with, when you're starting to just build the case for the C-suite, I think the first situation is here's the aggregate data. Overall, we're improving the sales team. The second level would be now I want to deep dive into which sales agent in particular am I really helping with this training. That's when you might need to look at individuals. But I think that's actually a much higher level of complexity of analysis. And at that point, you're probably going to, need to go to A/B testing and more complex things.
No
All
more questions
right,
right now. We've got
cool.
about 20 minutes left.
Cool, cool, cool. All right, so I've only got 2 more situations. So here's another situation. Let's say that I want to, in this case, I'm actually proposing something. So I want to propose a new employee onboarding initiative, right? I've got my reasons. I think the current employee onboarding, it's not very effective. I think a lot of our new hires come in, they get very confused, and then later they leave the company. And so I think we really need to redo our new employee onboarding. Now, I want to convince a C-suite to approve and provide resources for this proposal. But the problem is maybe my C-suite doesn't want to give me resources. Maybe they're going to say, I'm sorry, it's a recession. I'm not going to give you resources for new employee onboarding. It's not an unusual situation, right? It's the C-suite. Oftentimes, they feel their job is to make sure that resources are not spent wastefully. And so how do we convince them that a new employee onboarding actually could be useful, and to do it in a way that makes the C-suite feel like actually you are going to do a good job with it because you're providing an idea that can actually be tracked and measured in terms of impact on business performance. So here's what I would do is now I would try to connect to something else that matters to businesses, which is I talked about revenue. The other one is cost. Can you show that you're going to reduce costs for the organization? That makes people perk up, right? C-suite cares a lot about reducing costs. This is very, very important to them. And the graph that I'm sharing, this is called a benchmarking analysis, by the way. What I'm saying is if better onboarding could reduce our new hire attrition rate to the industry average, we could save about $2 million a year, right? So this is done by benchmarking. So what I did here is I looked at, this is our company's attrition rate for new hires, so maybe like a 1-year attrition rate. And I compared it to the industry average, right? There's lots of resources you can find online where you can find like industry averages and benchmarks for lots of different things. Here I'm using attrition as an example. And then based off of that, I did a quick back of the envelope calculation where if you just calculate for, based on the change in attrition, and I multiply that by the number of new hires, and I multiply that by the typical hiring costs. For hiring costs, you might need HR to tell you, like, this is how much it costs to hire a new person, hire an onboard. And then you just get that, and that's how you get a quick back of the envelope calculation. This kind of calculation doesn't need to be super deep and super rigorous. The idea is to give decision makers a general sense of, actually, if our attrition rate went down by like 1.5%, we would save a lot of money from not having to spend so much on like turnover and hiring costs. And at this point, this is just me making the case that actually onboarding, if the onboarding can reduce the new hire attrition, then that is a good business case for how actually investing in onboarding is going to reduce our costs in the long term. So investing in onboarding is actually a good business decision. It has ROI. And this also sets you up for how are you going to report on the onboarding later if it worked or not. Well, now you know exactly how you're going to do the pre and post analysis with the attrition rate, and you're going to show if you were actually able to affect the attrition rate at all. So that is a second situation where, in this case, I want to make the case for investing in a new L&D initiative. And for that, I need to find a business performance indicator that is important to the C-suite. I can share this with them, and I can say, hey, this is an indicator that you care a lot about. In this case, this is related to costs. I can help you to get it down. I have an idea for an L&D initiative that would actually help this to go down. I'm about to go into the third and final situation. Before I do, I think if there's any questions about how you can connect to the cost reduction. And here I also wanted to showcase a little bit about benchmarking. A couple of side questions that you might have is this the right benchmark? Right, like how do I find the right benchmark? There's lots of different benchmarks you can use. You can use benchmarks from the company in the past, or you can use benchmarks that you find elsewhere in terms of like industry standards or your competitors. Competitors are a great form of benchmark. I will be sharing my email and everything at the end. So if you ever have questions like, hey, I'm doing this analysis for the first time, I kind of want to just gauge if this is the right benchmark, you can always feel free to shoot me those questions. This is the kind of thing, by the way, that consultants do a lot of. Like benchmarking is a bread and butter part of how consultants communicate with decision makers, and decision makers love benchmarks. Like C-suite is benchmarking all the time, and I think a lot of the time, even their, like the way that their boards interact with them is also based on benchmarks. And then the second question is might be, well, okay, in this case, I actually calculated the expected savings. How do you actually calculate that? Like, what's the formula for that? So these kinds of back of the envelope math, as they call it, this kind of business math, it's very case by case. So feel free to shoot me an email later if you want some examples, and I can show you examples for a bunch of different metrics, right? Like if you want to show cost savings from attrition reduction, or if you want to show, cost savings from training people on a new software system, like all these types of things. There's kind of just different formulas. And they're usually arithmetic formulas. They're not particularly complex. Any questions about this one? Otherwise,
no questions yet.
Cool. Okay, so now I will finish with our very last situation. So this is, I think, the slightly more advanced one, but not so much more. Let's say that we have a situation, our company is struggling with access to qualified managers. So we don't have enough good managers, our managers are leaving, we've got retention issues, we've got promotion issues, we've got managers not, being effective, right? Pretty common problem. Now, let's say at the same time, we have a new CEO who came in. The new CEO is attempting to change the culture so that we can groom more internal hires for becoming managers. So there's a CEO, new CEOs, they like to launch a new bunch of programs, initiatives, they've got their thing going on. So that's happening. And on the other side, we were given permission that we can revamp the new manager training so that we can help groom the individual contributors that are high performing, and we can help them and we can groom them to become managers, right? So we want to give this new manager training or potential future manager training to the senior individual contributors. Individual contributors are basically people who are, working at the organization. They're almost at the manager level, but not quite yet. And so we want to give them the training and hopefully help them to go up to the next level. So now this is another opportunity for us to validate our business impact, because clearly managers are very important for the organization. C-suite cares a lot about manager performance, but the problem is, unlike the two other examples that I gave, manager performance is a lot harder to tie to revenue and to tie to cost reduction. So onboarding training, tie it to cost reduction. Sales training, marketing team training, those very easy to connect to revenue. Managers or these kinds of cross-cutting kind of functions, much harder. But at the same time, this also is something for which we have tools in business intelligence and data analysis. So Here's what I would do. So I shared with you before the pre and post analysis, which are probably the easiest way to connect L&D programs or activities to business performance. And now there's another way to do it, which is A/B testing. So A/B testing is a staple of business intelligence. It's really commonly used in fields like marketing, product development, even like sales outreach. They're all very heavy on A/B testing. And we can also learn from that because A/B testing is a great way to answer, I think, a question that maybe Christian raised earlier, which is how do we prove that our training is actually the thing that's causing the change in the KPI or in the business performance. So in this case, the business performance indicator that maybe I chose in this situation is, you know what, our senior ICs, we give them the training, and then 3 months later, how many of them actually got promoted to manager, right? Like presumably, and actually this is something I experienced in my last firm. My last firm had new manager training for all senior ICs, but not all senior ICs got promoted. Some senior ICs went to the training, but it didn't work or whatever. They didn't end up getting promoted, 3 months later. Maybe they got promoted 6 months later. Maybe they never got promoted at all. But the policy was, let's try and give the new manager training to as many people so that it motivates them, and so that it gives them the skills for when they do get promoted. Now, what I could do here is I want to track the rate, and this is the data that we're going to need to, get from say HR. What's the rate of people getting promoted after the training? So I want to track, maybe 3 months after the training, how many people are getting promoted. And the difference between a pre and post analysis and this is simply that here in an A/B test, I'm actually going to split all the potential participants into 2 groups, group A, group B, or the control group and the treatment group. The control group here might be something where I say, hey, either you're not going to get any training at all, or maybe I'm going to give you the old training, right? This is the status quo group. I'm not going to give you anything new. I'm going to give you the status quo. And then the second group, which is a treatment group, I'm going to give you the new training. Now, this is actually a little bit trickier to implement, but once you get stakeholder buy-in and once you show them how much it can really help you to identify whether your training is working, you can really build a culture internally of making A/B tests happen. And the thing that really, I think, should facilitate this is that A/B testing is not new. It's been done, like it's now very mainstream in marketing and other fields. So we can build on the success of other domains to show that. So in this case, what are we doing? We are showing, so we want to show that by going through our training, people are getting promoted into the next level, which is the objective of the training. So that's our impact on business performance. And the other thing is, why are they getting promoted or not promoted? Is it because of the training, or is it because of other factors like non-training factors? Like maybe it's the fact that there's a new CEO and the new CEO is launching all these new cultural initiatives. So the new CEO, maybe he's actually going to claim all the credit and say, actually, it's not because of your training, it's because of this new program that I launched. And that's actually why people are getting promoted. But when you do an A/B test, that no longer holds, right? Because when you do an A/B test, you can say, actually, both groups here, they're both at the company at the same time. Both of these groups, both of these groups are, if the CEO is the one whose initiatives are actually improving the promotion rate, we should see that happen to both groups. The only thing that is different between these 2 groups is that one group got the new training and one group did not. So any difference between the 2 groups we can say is purely based on the training. It's not based on other training, on other factors. So A/B testing is fantastic because it's a way to make sure that you're only showing the effect of the training. You're isolating any other factors that might be non-training related. So I hope, Christian, that answers your question from before. How can we show that it's the training that's causing the business impact and not the other thing? And the classic answer to this is experimental design, set up an A/B test. And I think on that note, I will kind of finish on this. 2 kind of side questions that might get asked. A/B tests have to be structured a specific way. you have to assign different people to each group, because otherwise you might think, well, if I put all my high performers in group 1 and all my low performers in group 2, then it's going to be really hard to, compare the results, and the data is not going to be valid. That's why A/B tests are structured in a certain way. You have to assign people in a certain way through random selection. You have to have a minimum number of people in each group. These are the kinds of things that a statistician or maybe someone in your organization that has experience with A/B tests can actually do that, because things like sample size calculations, things like confidence or hypothesis test calculation, they're not actually very hard to do nowadays. There's a lot of tools for this, and you can do them very, very quickly. So A/B testing, they have to be structured in a specific way, but it is actually not that difficult to set up. I would say the hardest part of A/B testing is actually not the statistics part or the experimental design. It's probably the stakeholder buy-in, because you have to convince your stakeholders that, like, no, I'm not going to give the new manager training to everyone. I'm only going to give it to half of the people, and the other half of the people are going to go through the other training. That is probably the harder one, getting the stakeholder buy-in. But if you can convince them or explain to them that this is the only way I can actually evaluate the true contribution of the training, and ultimately that's how you can actually evaluate the ROI of this training. Otherwise, if your stakeholders do not give you buy-in, that's okay. That just means you have to go back to the pre and post analysis. But if you can get beyond the pre and post analysis, then try to see if you can do an A/B test, because that's how you really are able to isolate your thing.
We've got about 5 minutes left. There was a comment about problems that can't actually be solved by training. I don't know if that relates at all to what you're describing here.
Yes, for sure. And I think this is actually one of the fundamental things, which is why I would actually, if you are worried that the training is not able to really deeply contribute to solving the problems, then you are probably on the same wavelengths of the C-suite. And that's actually why the C-suite doesn't give that much resources to L&D. Because if the C-suite thinks the same way as you, what they're going to think is, training's not going to solve my business performance problems. Business performance problems are the single thing I care the most about. And if training cannot show the data that they are actually affecting that, then training shouldn't get the resources. The resource should go to something else. And it's probably always going to be the case that training is not 100% of the solution. But I think we also know that good training can work. Like, L&D can make a difference. And so if we design good L&D, we have to trust in our own work that we can make an impact on some of these metrics. We might not be 100% of the solution. That's definitely true. I think that's probably almost always going to be the case. But we can make some impact, and being able to measure that impact and being able to communicate that impact, that's really what I want to summarize here, right? Which is that if we want to get the resources and communicate to the C-suite, we need to learn to speak their language. And speaking their language here is really identifying they care about revenue, they care about costs, they care about work performance, they care about risk. Show them how you are directly affecting those metrics or those indicators for them. And it's okay if it's not like 100, like we can't solve 100% of the problem, but you have to show that you're solving part of the problem. So I think I will, yeah, that's it for me. Any questions from anyone? And if you're ever in the situation where it's something like what I showed you before, where you're saying, hey, I need to report to my stakeholders, or I need to build stakeholder buy-in, and I need to make the case for why they should invest in my L&D initiative, why they should invest in my new training, why they should invest in this program or tools that I want to roll out. And since the whole theme of, I think what Megan has been sharing is like, we really need to build stakeholder buy-in. We need to really build those relationships so that xAPI can really achieve its potential. So this, what I've shared, is how I see us starting to speak the language of the decision makers and the C-suite. And if you're ever in those situations where you kind of just want a brain to bounce off of for your situation, feel free to reach out to me on email. This has been a lot of the work that I do. So if you're ever in a situation where you just want to get some thoughts, happy to schedule a quick chat and we can discuss it.
Thank you, Aurelien, and thanks everybody. I hope you're enjoying this xAPI day. I put the links up for the next couple sessions that start in about 15 minutes. See you then. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. All right.